Imagine standing at the edge of the world's most important waterway, watching a massive oil tanker slowly come to a stop. Not because of engine failure, not because of a storm, but because the most powerful military on Earth just blew up its engine room. The crew is running, the ship is dead in the water, and within minutes, soldiers are landing on top of it, taking everything inside: the oil, the cargo, the ship itself. Now here's the part that will shock you. The man who ordered all of this didn't hide it. He didn't deny it. He stood in front of a crowd and he bragged about it. He called it, and these are his exact words, a very profitable business. He laughed, he smiled, and then he said something that no world leader in modern history has ever said out loud. He said, "We're like pirates." Think about that for a second. The President of the United States standing at a podium comparing his own military to pirates. Not in a leaked recording, not in a private conversation, in a public speech. And the world watched. Some people laughed, some people were horrified. But while the cameras were focused on that moment, something much bigger was already happening beneath the surface. Because this wasn't just one ship, this wasn't just one ocean, and this definitely wasn't just about Iran. From the Caribbean to the Persian Gulf, from Chinese oil refineries to the small island of Cuba, a chain of events had already been set in motion. A chain that was quietly pulling the entire global economy towards something no one was fully prepared for. And the more you look at what's actually been happening, the more you realize this story goes far deeper than any headline has told you. Because the real question isn't whether this was piracy. The real question is, how long has this actually been going on? And who else has been paying the price? To answer that, you have to go back further than most people realize. Because what happened in the Strait of Hormuz this May didn't come out of nowhere. It was the latest move in a game that has been playing out for years. Quietly, consistently, and with very little pushback from the rest of the world. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points on the planet. It's a narrow stretch of water sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and before this conflict escalated, roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply passed through it every single day. 20%. That means 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil that powers your car, heats your home, and keeps global factories running was moving through that one narrow corridor. Now imagine what happens when that corridor gets blocked. When ships stop moving. When cargo stops flowing. The ripple effects don't just hit oil markets. They hit food prices. They hit medicine supplies. They hit economies on the other side of the world that never had anything to do with this conflict in the first place. But here's what made this moment different from anything before it. It wasn't Iran that shut down the strait. It was the United States. Through a military blockade ordered directly by the Trump administration, American naval forces began stopping, boarding, and seizing Iranian cargo ships moving through these waters. And the justification? Sanctions. The argument was that Iran wasn't allowed to sell its oil, that any ship carrying Iranian cargo was fair game. But here's the part that gets complicated very quickly. These were not United Nations sanctions. These were not internationally recognized legal orders backed by global consensus. These were unilateral American sanctions, meaning the United States decided on its own, without the approval of the international community, that Iran could not conduct trade. And under international law, that distinction matters enormously. Because when you board a foreign vessel in international waters without legal authority recognized by the global community, there is a word for that. And that word is exactly what Trump himself used: piracy. Now, what made the world pay closer attention wasn't just the act itself, it was the history behind it. Because this pattern, American forces seizing foreign ships and taking their cargo, had happened before. It happened in 2023 under the Biden administration, when the U.S. seized nearly 1 million barrels of Iranian oil, and barely anyone in mainstream media treated it as the international incident it actually was. It happened in 2020, during Trump's first term, when the Department of Justice openly boasted about the largest ever American seizure of Iranian fuel from 4 tanker ships bound for Venezuela. And it happened again just months before this latest escalation, when Trump stood before cameras and casually announced that the United States had seized 1.9 million barrels of Venezuelan oil and was simply keeping it. Keeping the oil. Keeping the ships. Just like that. The world had seen pieces of this story before, but always in isolation, always framed differently, always buried beneath other headlines. But now, for the first time, all of it was converging at once. And what was building on the horizon was something far more serious than a few seized tankers. Because while the world was still processing what it had just seen, something else was already happening. Something that would take this story far beyond the Persian Gulf and far beyond Iran. And it started, of all places, with a meme. When the images first appeared online, people laughed. AI-generated pictures of Donald Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth dressed as pirates. Tricorn hats, eye patches, the whole image. The meme spread fast. The joke wrote itself. Pirates of the Caribbean, except this time it was real, and the treasure wasn't fictional gold, it was millions of barrels of oil. But here's the thing about moments like this. Sometimes the joke is covering something much darker underneath. Because while people were laughing at the memes, economists were quietly looking at the numbers. And what they were seeing wasn't funny at all. The International Energy Agency came out and said it directly. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz had triggered the largest oil supply disruption in modern history. Not a disruption caused by a war between two countries fighting over territory. A disruption caused by one country deciding it had the right to control who gets to sell what, and using its military to enforce that decision on the open sea. And the consequences of that decision were already spreading in ways most people hadn't even begun to connect. Because oil isn't just fuel. It's the foundation of the global supply chain. It moves through pipelines and refineries and shipping lanes, and it eventually becomes the plastic in your packaging, the fertilizer in your farmland, the chemicals that keep hospitals running. And a massive portion of those chemicals, the ones used in fertilizers that farmers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America depend on, those come directly from the Persian Gulf region. So when the Strait of Hormuz gets locked down, it doesn't just raise gas prices. It starts a chain reaction that moves towards something much more frightening, a food crisis. And this wasn't a fringe theory. This was being said out loud by serious institutions and serious analysts who had spent their careers tracking exactly these kinds of systemic risks. But even that wasn't the part that was making the most powerful governments in the world nervous. Because there was one country watching all of this more closely than anyone else. One country that had more at stake in this situation than perhaps even Iran itself. And that country was China. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China buys the vast majority of Iran's oil. And for years, China had been doing this quietly, carefully, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid a direct confrontation with Washington. But what happened next showed that that careful distance was over. On the 1st of May, the United States State Department made an announcement. It had imposed new sanctions. Not on Iran this time, on China. Specifically, on Chinese companies that had been purchasing Iranian crude oil and refining it into petroleum products. The State Department called it, quote, decisive action to disrupt Iran's illicit oil trade. But here's where that framing falls apart completely. Iran's oil trade is not illicit. No international court, no United Nations resolution, no global legal body has declared Iran's oil trade illegal. The sanctions that make it appear illegal are American sanctions, imposed unilaterally by Washington, recognized by no one else in the world as legally binding. So what the United States was actually doing was telling Chinese companies that they had to follow American law even inside China's own borders, and it was willing to punish them financially if they didn't. Now, this had happened before in a limited way. The U.S. had previously targeted what are known as teapot refineries in China, small privately owned operations that were processing Iranian oil. Those moves caused tension, but didn't cross any major threshold. But this time was different. This time, the United States didn't go after a small private refinery. It went after Hengli. And the moment that name entered the conversation, everything shifted. Hengli is not a small operation. It is one of China's most strategically important petrochemical facilities. Located in Dalian, a major coastal city in northeastern China, this single facility processes 20 million tons of crude oil every single year. It was built with an investment of 280 billion renminbi. Dalian itself is one of China's 7 major petrochemical bases, and Hengli sits at the center of it. It is the endpoint and export terminal for entire northeastern provinces. It is a core piece of China's green hydrogen strategy. It produces ethylene, coal chemicals, and dozens of other petrochemical products that feed directly into China's broader industrial economy. As one prominent Chinese analyst put it, Hongli is a huge deal. Other companies cannot avoid working with them. This wasn't a symbolic sanction. This was the United States reaching deep inside China's industrial backbone and squeezing. And Beijing's response made clear that a line had been crossed. China has always opposed American unilateral sanctions. For years, Beijing had called them illegal, had refused to recognize them officially, but had allowed Chinese companies to quietly comply in practice because they were afraid of being cut off from the American financial system. That quiet compliance was now ending. China invoked what legal scholars call its blocking statute, a legal mechanism that formally orders all Chinese companies not to recognize, not to enforce, and not to comply with American sanctions. This was not a vague political statement. It was a legal mandate. A professor of international trade law at the National University of Singapore, Henry Gao, who is frequently cited by major Western publications as one of the leading experts in this field, pointed out that this was the first time China had ever formally invoked this statute in response to American pressure. That detail matters enormously, because what it means is that China is no longer just saying these sanctions are wrong. China is now legally requiring its entire corporate sector to defy them. And if you think about what that means practically, it means that American financial pressure, which for decades has been one of Washington's most powerful tools for controlling global behavior, is now being directly challenged by the world's second largest economy. And it wasn't just Iran and China. Because while all of this was unfolding, the Trump administration was simultaneously turning its attention somewhere else entirely. On that same 1st of May, the same day the State Department announced sanctions on Chinese companies, the White House signed a new executive order targeting Cuba. Not a minor adjustment, a sweeping, aggressive new order that, according to legal scholars who had read it carefully, would allow the United States to sanction virtually any person or company anywhere in the world that conducted any business of any kind with Cuba. One American legal expert, someone who had previously worked inside the Biden administration and had personally helped draft sanctions against Russia, read this executive order and described it in simple terms. He said it gave Washington the firepower to drive every remaining international business out of Cuba. This was a medieval siege. A small island nation, already struggling under 60 years of American economic pressure, now facing a new level of suffocation, designed specifically to collapse its economy from the outside. But here's what made this moment particularly significant, because China was watching that too. And China was already responding, not with threats, not with statements, with solar panels. Hundreds of thousands of solar panels being shipped directly to Cuba, giving the island the energy it needed to keep its hospitals running, its schools open, its homes lit, even as the United States tried to cut off every other source of power it had. And that image, China quietly powering a besieged island while the world's most powerful military was seizing oil tankers on the open sea, that image captured something that analysts and historians were beginning to say out loud. That the more aggressively the American empire pushed, the more it was pushing the rest of the world in exactly the opposite direction. But just when it seemed like the situation had reached its most complex point, just when it seemed like all of these moving pieces, Iran, China, Cuba, the global oil markets, the food supply chains, the financial system, were finally coming into full view, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in policy, not just in politics, but in the entire architecture of global power that the world had been living inside for the past several decades. Because what was happening wasn't simply a dispute between the United States and Iran. It wasn't simply a trade argument between Washington and Beijing. What was emerging piece by piece, sanction by sanction, seized tanker by seized tanker, was the beginning of a direct confrontation between the American empire and the rest of the world. And the numbers told a story that most headlines weren't willing to say clearly. The Washington Post had published a report just the year before, revealing that 1/3 of every country on Earth currently faces some form of American sanctions. 1/3. That means if you took a map of the world right now and colored in every nation under American economic pressure, you would be coloring in a massive portion of the planet. And it doesn't stop there. 60% of the world's lowest income nations, the poorest countries on Earth, are living under some form of American sanctions. These are not rogue states. These are not military threats. Many of them are small, struggling nations trying to feed their people and build their economies, and they are being squeezed by the most powerful financial system ever constructed in human history. And then came the number that stopped people cold. A peer-reviewed study published in The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world, concluded that Western sanctions, primarily American and European, had been directly associated with 564,000 deaths every single year on average between 1971 and 2021. That is not a political opinion. That is a scientific finding published in a medical journal. 500,000 people dying annually, year after year, quietly, without headlines, without accountability. Many of them children, because when sanctions cut off medicine and medical equipment and basic goods, it is always the youngest and most vulnerable who die first. And in that context, what Trump had done wasn't just controversial. It wasn't just legally questionable. It was the loudest, most visible, most openly admitted version of something that had been happening in silence for generations. He had simply removed the polite language. He had taken off the diplomatic mask and said it plainly. We took the ship. We took the oil. We're keeping it. And it's profitable. That honesty, if you can call it that, had cracked something open. Because for the first time in a long time, countries that had been quietly suffering under American economic pressure were now watching the most powerful man on Earth confirm what they had always known, but had never been able to get the world to acknowledge. And they were responding. China was no longer quietly absorbing American pressure. It was publicly, legally, and institutionally defying it. The blocking statute wasn't a press release. It was a declaration. It was Beijing telling every corporation inside its borders that American financial threats no longer held the authority they once did. And China wasn't alone. Across the global south, across the nations that make up BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and dozens of regional alliances that had been quietly growing stronger for years, governments were looking at this moment and drawing the same conclusion, that the system that had promised them stability and integration had actually been designed to keep them dependent. And the more aggressively it was enforced, the more clearly that design became visible. Even mainstream Western academics, scholars sitting inside the very institutions that had built and defended this system, were now publishing books and research papers warning that the American sanctions regime was backfiring, that it was not weakening the countries it targeted, it was pushing them together. It was accelerating the construction of alternative financial systems, alternative trade routes, alternative currencies, and alternative alliances that were specifically designed to operate outside of American control. The empire was swinging harder than it ever had. And in doing so, it was making the walls around it more visible to more people than ever before. And even after that realization began to settle across the world, even after the evidence had stacked up this high, the consequences of everything that had been set in motion were far from over. Because the consequences were still unfolding. And the most important one wasn't happening in a courtroom or a military briefing room or even in the halls of the United Nations. It was happening in the minds of ordinary people, in governments that had spent decades trying to work within a system that was now revealing itself more openly than ever before. Think about what had actually been witnessed in just this short window of time. A sitting American president standing at a podium and calling his own military pirates. Iranian ships seized in international waters. Venezuelan oil taken and kept without apology. A Chinese petrochemical giant sanctioned in what Beijing called a direct crossing of the line. Cuba being pushed toward complete economic collapse by an executive order that one legal expert described as giving Washington the power to sanction anyone, anywhere, for any connection to the island. And underneath all of it, 500,000 people dying every single year from the quiet, invisible violence of economic sanctions that most of the world never even hears about. This was not a story about one rogue decision or one controversial speech. This was a story about a system operating at full force, without restraint, without apology, and for the first time in a long time, without the ability to hide what it was doing. And that visibility was changing things. Countries that had never formally aligned with each other were finding common ground. Trade networks that bypassed the American financial system were being built faster than ever before. The dollar's grip on global transactions, once considered untouchable, was loosening in ways that economists who had spent their careers dismissing this possibility were now being forced to acknowledge. And China, the country at the center of so much of this, was not backing down. It was not recalculating. It was not looking for a quiet off-ramp. It was moving forward, openly, legally, and with the full weight of its economy behind every step. The memes had come and gone. The speeches had been made. The sanctions had been signed. But the deeper story, the one that would matter 5 years and 10 years from now, was the story of a world that had been pushed too hard for too long and was finally, visibly, building something different. History doesn't always announce itself with a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives through a series of decisions that only make complete sense when you look at all of them together. And right now, if you are paying attention, you are watching one of those moments. The question isn't whether the world is changing. The question is whether most people are watching closely enough to understand what the change actually means. And that is exactly why stories like this one need to be told, and told clearly, without the filters that usually soften the edges of what is actually happening. If this story made you think, if it connected dots you hadn't seen connected before, drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation matters and your perspective is part of it. If you want to keep following what's really happening in the world, beyond the surface-level headlines, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, this story is far from over.